Salut tout le monde, à tout tati et tout ça. I'm joking. We're not going to actually go around schtroumpfer tout ça. We're not going to do. Yeah, okay. Anyone who is French will understand the references. Mais en tout cas, let's get on with the podcast. Now, this podcast will only be covering the later Carolingien period and a good chunk of the early Capetien period. And as you'll see in this episode, the Capetiens are really just a rebranding of the Carolingien dynasty. And, well, sort of. We're going to cover that probably more in a later episode, but we're going to cover a bit of the roots of the Carolingien in this part, and there's a part 2 that'll cover a bit of the later 9th century. En tout cas, at the start of this period in the history of West Francia, East Francia, or Germany, was to later, become a little more dominated by magnates and lords until, of course, the Attonier, the Saxe dynasty took over. While in the West, it was the Capetiens. Centuries before, the Merovingians had control of both parts to an extent, well, more the West. The East was not yet fully colonized and whatnot. We're not going to cover the Merovingian part of this chapter because it's already been covered in another podcast. And why bother retreading old ground? So we'll just skip forward to Charles Martel. Charles Martel was an illegitimate son of Pepin de Heristal, and Pepin de Heristal was a Maire du Palais who achieved incredible power over the royal court of the Merovingians. And he won a civil war, and his son was later to wage his own civil war and grab power himself. Because on Pepin's death, his widow, Plectrude, tried to imprison Charles. She did for a time, but then he escaped and became Maire d'Austrasie. That is to say, what would later become the foundation for Germany. And he was to end up winning this war and would become sole Maire du Palais of the two Francia. In turn, though, meanwhile, Spain was being, how do I put it, put to the sword. And the Moors, or I should say the Islamic invasion of Spain, was proceeding and made it all the way up to, well, Aquitaine. Charles Martel, of course, gathered together the military, trained it, and ended up achieving a spectacular victory at Toul in 732, that is to say 732. But by then, of course, Autun was sacked in 725. So his victory was a massive one, and along with a series of other later victories, he was able to turn the tide against Islam and force them south of the Pyrenees, mountains that lie to the south of France, and cut it off from Spain. Charles Martel ruled over Neustrie and Austrasie and really quarantined the Merovingian lineage off from all power. He won for himself the nickname Martel, which has stuck to this day. He was obviously a great man of history, and what's interesting is that while he's credited as having fought with knights, he didn't actually have knights. And how he used his cavalry wasn't how you might expect. He more used the horses to transport his army to the location than had them fight on foot, from what I understand. And this turned back the Islamic tide. But his vanguard stood like a wall. Meanwhile, he sent some men behind at the Bataille de Toul and just grabbed what booty and treasure had been taken from Spain and from Aquitaine, and then pincered and tricked the Muslims into thinking that that the camp had been lost and the battle was lost, and he pincered them. And this was such a brilliant victory. This was in a way Islam's Cannae, at least as far as its conquest into the West at that time. And though Islam's followers didn't realize it at the time, they would never march north of the Pyrenees ever again. And this is largely thanks to Charles and his grandson, also another Charles, immense victories, as well as the incredible bravery and courage of the Spanish. Meanwhile, while this is going on, the Visigoths had regrouped because the Frank had given them breathing room by distracting the Muslims, had regrouped in what it became the kingdom of Asturias and began to build their military might and have lots of babies, and that became the new generations of Visigoths or Spaniards. And from this kingdom of Asturias would come the other kingdoms. Charlemagne's victories on the other side of the Pyrenees would build up what would become Aragon and Navarre. And these two kingdoms would kind of serve as buffers between France and Islamic Spain, Al-Andalusia. And in turn, you had, of course, how do I put it? Asturias, which got breathing room, like I said, because you had these other kingdoms and you had the French to kind of distract for a time. Now, I say that Charlemagne kind of planted the seeds. It's more that he invaded. There was territory auctioned off to the Frank that served under him in that region. But it's more his son Louis who, because Charles' initial victories didn't secure him much gains and the territory fell. Then Louis came in, pushed further in, but Louis didn't fully manage to hold on to it very securely. And then the Spanish later took that territory and built around it. So when I say the French kind of did it, take it with a grain of salt. It's more the Spanish who did that. But it's kind of like a Franco-Spanish effort that helped plant seeds for a territory that was Christian, not Islamic, and that had a cultural mixture of sorts. And this was as important in some ways as the victories to Asturias early in its history scored. Because, like I said, this distracted, and it served to kind of keep the Moors busy until the Spanish could build a kingdom. So, bienvenue, you're welcome, Spaniards.
De nada.
But that said, I don't say this to be contemptuous of the Spanish. I just say this as we distracted. We didn't build anything lasting, but we distracted. Yeah, sometimes that's as valuable as actually contributing something more than that.
Sometimes something a little tiny can make huge waves.
And that's what this episode's also all about, because we have the Traité de Verdun, which would have exceptional influence on history. Now, Charles ruled from 737 onwards without a king, so that he was sometimes called the vice-king, and by an abbey called, in this book, Ectalnash, which called him Le Roi Charles, or King Charles. He is buried, or was buried, at Saint Denis. Naturally, real quick, before we continue, Jim Bradbury also ends up making one wild claim, right? That's very wild, very stupid. He claims at one point that Melville was not actually king of the Frank. Well, then how did Clovis become king? But in reality, what he's proposing is that Melville wasn't a true king, he was just a chieftain. Yeah, but he was king. And yes, he didn't conquer all that many territories, but he began the process of conquest. And it was Clovis who, spearheaded. Now, he does make this point, but he kind of doesn't give Melville the credit Melville deserves. And that's just a quick aside because we skipped over that in our hurry to get to Charles Martel. But Charles Martel is exciting. He's very exciting, a historic figure. Or as the best lecturer at my university when I was an undergrad called him, sexy, because he liked to joke around that the great men of history are the sexiest men in history.
No doubt about that.
Yeah, and he was also a man happily married for 40 years to a very delightful lady. So kudos to him for, cracking these jokes. And, well, yeah. So he tended to say Charles Martel was the first sexy man in French history. And Charlemagne vastly surpassed him in this manner. Well, in this regard, which was pretty funny. But from this victory would come more victories for the line that Charles Martel built. Now, for one thing, Pepin, his son, was not to rule without Merovingien. And he was to, how do I put it? He was to rule with a Merovingien called Childeric III, or Childeric III. And the thing is, Pepin would end up deposing him in 751, and he died, the Merovingien died in 755. Pepin took the royal title in his own right around this time. Now, we do have a letter from Pepin to the Pope where he asks about who should rule. And in the English translation, the Pope Zachariah says, "It is better to give the name of king to one who has the wisdom and the power rather than to one who has only the name of king without the authority." He has a point.
Yes, and that is a powerful sentiment, because there are times where a royal dynasty, they often start off very powerful, but as time passes,
They weaken. Yeah. Like, the Merovingian kind of started this way. They had Melve, who was ambitious and brutal. Clovis was much the same way. But then the Merovingian descended into madness and insanity. I would say they were also roi feignants, that is to say, imbecilic kings. You can actually probably make a comparison between the Hanovers and the Merovingian in terms of insanity, tendency towards, well, not being very pleasant figures, and just being petty individuals by nature. Whereas the Carolingians arguably are just very, very clever people. They're very competent, they're very strong at first, and then they weaken and become like the Merovingian.
And I'll also add this to the Carolingians. They were never a messed up royal family lineage like the Merovingian.
No, they're actually easier to remember because the Merovingian had all sorts of marriages and whatnot and concubines. Charlemagne had a lot of concubines, but he never had the confused family tree of the Merovingian. Now, Pepin le Bref is in here called the Short, but the translation from bref to short, that's actually not accurate. Now, cool is short, but bref is not short. Bref is the brief. So, it's weird to call him the Short.
If they were to say short time.
But the funny thing is he reigned for 17 years, I believe. Yeah, 17 years he reigned for. But, technically speaking, let me just check Charles Martel. He died in 741. So technically, Pepin reigned for actually around 27 years. So he didn't rule briefly. He ruled a very long time. And yet, he's called the Brief. Yeah. Now, if you think they're cracking a joke about height, well, Pepin was very, very tall. We know this. He was at least about 6 feet tall. And so one historian said, well, maybe they're trying to call someone who was really tall tiny. But actually, bref doesn't mean short. It does, but it means more brief. So it's more, I think, a joke about his long reign, which just seemed to go on and on and on. It was a very long reign. Not as long as Charlemagne, but it was still a long period. The early Carolingians all reigned for a very, very long time. Charles Martel reigns from around 714 I believe it is, up to 741. Pepin reigns from 741 to 768. And Charlemagne reigns up until from 768 to 814. That's a long reign. 46 years is how long the reign is, I believe. So Charlemagne reigns for this long period. And it's not a short reign. It's not an inglorious one. This is probably the most glorious reign any European ruler has ever had. Because where Augustus Caesar was a brilliant leader and ushered in a golden age and was perhaps history's greatest politician, but he was ultimately not a man who led from the front all the time. And he left, in terms of the succession, a bit of a disaster. Well, not that it was much better from Caesar to him, because Caesar left a bit of a mess for Augustus to clean up. Charlemagne inherited a bit of a mess, but left a firm succession. And he left his heir with all the tools and weapons he might need to combat any threat. And he left a realm that was pretty much at peace and that had subdued their enemies, either politically or militarily. Well, I remember once a historian saying, anything and everything you hear about Charlemagne that praises him is not enough. He was even more glorious and great, and not even Napoleon can compare to him. That was a praise I once saw in a documentary, and I remember just going, oh, why? And yet Charlemagne weirdly is being forgotten in today's age by a lot of people. Not by the French, but by every non-Français. And it's just like, how can you forget about this man? This man was the greatest European leader in history.
The world wouldn't be the same without him.
No. You wouldn't have Germany, you wouldn't have France, you wouldn't have Spain, you wouldn't have Italy, really. You wouldn't have even England, I'd argue, if indirectly. And we also got to bear in mind, Charlemagne, for England, he was in contact with Offa, who built that famous dike in England. But Offa offered tribute to Charlemagne. So, if you were to compare him to the Chinese, he was accepting tribute from foreign dignitaries and emptying off in them. And so, he's also important in this context as a bit of the ruler of Europe. Now, this was normally something that the Constantinople emperors were doing, but Charlemagne was doing it in the West. For the first time in centuries, there was a Western ruler powerful enough to do this. Not since the days of, the Western emperors was anyone able to do this. And even then, I would argue it might not be since the days of Aetius that there was a Western leader capable of, conferring titles and rank as far away as, maybe not England, but almost there. So there has to be a lot of credit given to Charlemagne. Now, enough praise will let his magnificent, glorious deeds speak for themselves. Now, upon his ascension to the throne, Pepin left him with a great many gifts. For one thing, he left him a large domain in Austrasie and in Nestri. Well, really, he left Austrasie to his second son, Carloman, and left Charlemagne, Nestri. Now we'll get to what happens next in a bit. Pepin had also subdued the Lombard king Eistulf, and conferred the some Italian estates to the papacy. And he won Septimanie from the Muslims, and in 8 annual campaigns conquered Aquitaine. The Basques submitted to him, and Pepin died in Paris on the 24th of September 768. After, you know what? A pretty badass reign. Like, Pepin le Bref was a real badass and an amazing monarch in his own right. If his son was not Charlemagne, he'd probably be considered one of those great men of history, especially for that era.
People remember his father and people remember his son. But we often forget that he was just as grand as both his father and his son.
Well, I wouldn't say he's as grand as his son, but definitely as grand as his father. I really like Pepin. I don't know why, but ever since I was a little boy and I learned about him, I just really liked Pepin le Bref. He's Pepin le Premier, technically. But, why did the French monarchs stop using the name Pepin? It's a great name. And, this is a king whom, honestly, he accomplished a lot. He was so amazing. He took his family, which was a mayoral family that could probably be contested in terms of their claim to the power, and cemented their power as the sole monarchs of the Frankish Empire. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he reconquered Aquitaine and pushed into Septimanie. He made sure that the Muslims were firmly kept south of the Pyrenees, and he marched into Italy, which was a prelude to Charlemagne's own conquest there. Now on to Charlemagne. Now, when Charlemagne first comes to office, what is so fascinating about him is that at first him and his brother Carloman do not get along. They hated each other. And we don't know what happens next. The two apparently hated each other so badly, they communicated with each other only via their mom, Beltrade, who was a great lady. She was a grande dame. Beltrade apparently was a political genius. Mathilde and Aliénor d'Aquitaine are nothing on her, apparently. She apparently was probably a beautiful young woman at one time, because she attracted the attention of Pepin, who married possibly for love, because we know she started off as his concubine, so she enthralled him. I'm not sure we know her family. We know, though, that she clearly took an interest in the education of her sons. She clearly doted on them, and clearly took an interest in politics. And she was a commanding presence whom apparently held enormous influence over her principal son, who seems to have had a bit of a mommy complex. And for Charlemagne to be a mama's boy and to revere his mother this much, she must have been an amazing leader and woman. In her own, I say amazing leader, just in her own right. She was clearly a lady who could hold her own to someone as great as Pepin. And Beltrade was to give birth to Charlemagne possibly in 742, possibly in 747, as late as then. It's just, the date's not entirely sure. I'm going to say my opinion. I've actually never heard the 747 or 748 until I was an adult. 742, I heard 743, 744, even 745 when I was a teen. But as a kid, it was always 742 or 743. So I will actually say we go with the earlier date. The only reason I'm going to insist it's the earlier date is that the later ones, it's just, like I said, for them to be favored when, all of a sudden over the years strikes me as a bit revisionist, and I'm suspicious of revisionism. It's just not something I trust. And like I said, I'm gonna go on the earlier sources and earlier historians. Now there are some newer historians who are often more correct than older ones. Obviously, new discoveries are made and whatnot. But in this case, I've never heard the 747 until pretty much this book. Every other source, especially French books, tend to say 742. Some French sources recently have been saying 748, which the fact that newer historians are saying, well, it's either 47 or 48, I'm not going to trust. I'm going to stick to the traditional ones because newer ones can't seem to make up their mind, while older sources obviously were saying, no, it's firmly this. So, or at least they were like, no, it's 42 or 43. More recent ones are more unsure. If you're less decisive about things, I view it as you're not as certain of yourself. So why would I trust you? I guess it's like that. If that sounds somewhat arbitrary, like I said, it's just that primary and secondary sources usually prefer 742, which, like I said, I've never heard of the 747 or 748 possibility until a short time ago. So, not going to go with it. Not going to trust it. That said, Pepin would end up, of course, at one point sending his sons Charles and Charlemagne on an expedition to Aquitaine. This was during his reign. And apparently this was supposed to be kind of their apprenticeship. And I suspect he was trying to also get them to bond. But I also suspect this campaign saw the two squabble a bit. Because we know the two hate each other. Like I said, though, they just did not trust each other and would not be friendly with one another. And the conquest of Aquitaine dominated the first part of Charlemagne's reign. But he didn't really go to war initially. Now, his share of the inheritance was Western Aquitaine, Neustrie, Ustrie, and Bavarie. But he usurped his brother, Carloman. And, well, after the man's death, sort of. Now, what happened is Carloman dies in 771. We don't know what happens. It's just he dies. It could be illness. Charlemagne might have had a hand in it. We don't know. Now, secular historians today just often love to just say, well, we've got no evidence. That is evidence. No, actually, non-evidence is not evidence. Only in some rare situations is it like that. In this one, I'm not even going to try to guess or throw in conjecture. We know Charlemagne had the motive. Did he have the means? We don't know. Killing a king isn't as easy sometimes as it looks. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So, don't know. But he usurped his nephew's claims, took over his brother's territories, and then launched into a series of conquests that would be extraordinary. No European leader or ruler has ever launched on such a brilliant series of military campaigns since, and has conquered so much of Europe since. Napoleon had some brilliant conquests, but they were all undone. Ultimately, he lost. And ultimately, Napoleon wasn't able to make it stick. Caesar was brilliant, and yeah, Caesar, like I said, would be the previous leader one could say probably surpassed Charlemagne in terms of conquests. But Charlemagne, after Caesar, is probably the man who conquered the most amount of territory in European history. at this time. And then you have Napoleon, of course. But the problem with Napoleon, to compare him, is that Bonaparte really kept using the same strategies and also had the problem of constantly facing the same coalitions. Now, the difference is the coalitions eventually wore Napoleon down until they won at Waterloo. Whereas Charlemagne, weirdly, the coalitions kept wearing down his enemies. He was able to outlast them and outfox them by establishing far more fortresses, bases, and whatnot. Because the thing is, it was really the Saxons who kept forming coalitions with, I guess you could call them the Danes, further up north, and they kept raiding into his territory. Now, he invaded their land, the Germanic lands of the Saxons. Then, you had the coalitions constantly forming against him. Charlemagne eventually wore them down and even got their leader to convert to Christianity. So he, wore them down rather than letting himself get worn down. But we'll get to that in a minute. I know we're going back and forth quite often. But first off, Charlemagne established, when it comes to Aquitaine, in 781, the kingdom of Aquitaine for his son, Louis le Pieux. Now, this book skips over a lot. Now, Charlemagne himself could be an entire podcast series. And I was planning to do an entire podcast series about him when we get to the book called Charlemagne down the road. And yes, I want to check out some more French sources and cross-reference and whatnot. He really did live a really brilliant, amazing life. And like I said, if, let's say, a Napoleon podcast would be 30 episodes, Charlemagne could be 60. It's just, he did so much. He's just amazing. Now, on Christmas Day in the year 800, as everyone knows, he was crowned Empereur des Romains, Emperor of the Romans. But he had taken the title of Emperor 2 days before for himself. So, technically, he didn't need the papacy to crown him. And later, he was to crown his son, l'Empereur des Francs, later on. And he was to crown his heir himself, because he already knew that if the Pope could give a title, he could take it away. He could already foresee the investiture problem. But on the other hand, having the Pope backing him up, like the Pope had backed up, a previous Pope, backed up his father, Pepin, he needed the Pope's approval. And we mustn't forget that Charlemagne was a passionate Christian. He was very, very pious. At this time, everybody was very, very, very pious, with good reason. Now, he ended up starting his war in Saxe in 772 and launched 18 campaigns. Now, this book says it was a savage war of conquest. It was. And the thing is, Widukind was the leader who gave Charlemagne the most amount of trouble and formed coalitions with other Nordic barbarians and kept fighting and fighting and fighting. This leader began his causing problems in 778. But in 782, some officials were beaten in the Suntel Mountains. I can't pronounce that. I'm not sure how. Any Nordic or Scandinavian, I should say, listeners, please do clarify the pronunciation. I'd appreciate it. Charlemagne, though, decided that in punishment at the enemy not submitting was La Fale Sanglante de Verdun, the bloody affair at Verdun, in which 4,500 Sacs were brutally put down. He was pretty mad.
Did we also forget to mention that this was a very brutal time?
Yeah. But honestly, like, he taught them a lesson. Like, you have to bear in mind, at this time, this was a matter that he was trying to extend into their lands. Yes. But he's trying to extend civilization and the cross. Yes. But the thing is, they had challenged him there. If he did not match them brutality for brutality, they would just keep raiding and violating nuns and pillaging and plundering into his lands. He had to, there was a border. I know a border is not really a concept many people are familiar with today, but back then it was a big deal. Actually, it should still be a big deal to have a border, but, modernity. In 785, he extended the death sentence again, and this time extended it to Sacs who attacked churches, ate meat during Lent, which back then was a bigger deal than it is today. Lent, I mean, as a celebration for a lot of people. Killed bishops and priests, refused baptisms, or returned to pagan burial practices. So he wasn't kidding around. Now, naturally, he ordered the deportation of 10,000 Sacs from both sides of the Elbe, including wives and children. Their lands were handed to Slavs and Frank, and Charles eventually did moderate his laws in 797. Ugh. When fines replaced some of the death sentences. Now, Charles also ended up going to war against the Avar in the east, and they were defeated in 796, and apparently they carried off 15 large wagon loads of treasure, which made Charlemagne incredibly wealthy. Now, interestingly, the Avar's capital was called the Ring. Well, it's also called a religious site, but it was both, I guess. And the Vikings, of course, would construct fleets, in the North Sea, and would start their raids around this time. So, yeah. Charlemagne would get the idea, actually, of building a flotille, a navy, but things wouldn't go over very well. But he began the process. His heirs would burn the process. Because, what was he thinking? Better to start slaughtering each other. Because,
It worked for the Merovingians.
Yeah, I know, right? But, and when I say his heirs, I mean his grandchildren. Now, he did end up taking the Iron Crown of Lombardy for himself, and he confirmed the papacy's lands, the papal lands, and made his son Pepin king of Italy. So he's obviously accomplished a lot. He also had to kind of annex Bavaria, which was vital for defending against the Avars. Tassillon was to rebel, but he was captured and sentenced to death, but for himself on Charlemagne's mercy and thrown into an abbey. And then Tassillon's brother-in-law, Giraud, reigned until that guy rebelled and was killed. Wow. Bavaria. Why can't you guys remember your old traditions of rebellion? I'm joking, actually. You guys have a bad habit. I don't know what else to say. I don't know whether to say you should curb it or whether you should relive it. Might be interesting either way. And I hope people don't mind me being flippant. Charlemagne would only really suffer one semi-defeat, and that was during the retreat along Roncesvalles, which was an ambush. His rear guard was took the brunt, and of course Roland, his nephew, was killed. And you have Le Geste Roland, which is, my gosh, it's so freaking magnificent, and such a big inspiration for the my mythic fiction en français, notably some of my writing with Héraclès in French, and of course Chute d'Innocence, and the current book which I'm tentatively calling Les Quatre Paladins. So this, oh man, I love the Geste Roland. I'm sorry, it's so well written. Anyways, enough gushing. And it's the closest thing France has come to fantasy fiction / mythic fiction. A damn shame. For shame, français. Mes frères et sœurs, rappelez-vous du fait que ceci est la langue de Molière et d'Alex Dumas et Victor Hugo. Nous sommes héritiers à Roland et Charles. Charlemagne, je devrais dire. Qu'est-ce que vous faisiez? Sorry, that was a message specifically for French listeners. Écrivez, écrivez, écrivez. Write. Because we need more French literature. Lots more. Anyways, as for Charlemagne, he also he set up a massive system in which a lot of territory was divided up between various comtes, and then he created the office of, he developed a system of representatives begun by the Merovingians, which is the Missi Dominici. The Missi were basically the sheriffs. They went out into the counties and kept an eye on the comtes. And typically they worked in pairs, one layman and one ecclesiastic. So you couldn't really execute one of them, so no matter what, if you executed the secular official, the ecclesiastical one would return and say, hey, this guy's rebelling. So, pretty impressive stuff. Very forward thinking, actually.
Yeah.
Because one of them you could count on clerical immunity. There's a lot more we can get into, but we're kind of strapped for time, so we're just going to skip ahead. Sadly, because Charlemagne is
very fascinating.
Very cool. I really, really, really want to also... there's two books in particular I just want to get into him. It's just hard skipping. Because I want to, I've got a folklore about Charlemagne book, which I really like. It's about all the myths and legends of Charlemagne. It's really cool. I got Le Geste Roland, I really want to do a book club down the road of. And there's, of course, textbooks I want to examine. But it's hard because, we're strapped for time. Anyways, Louis Pieux. Louis le Pieux. Now, of course, Charlemagne, when he died after he went hunting. Because, he wasn't a sissy. He didn't go golfing going, boop! Better jump into the cart. Okay, pop. Sorry, I hate golf. And actually I hold rich millionaires and billionaires who go golfing in contempt. But hunting, now that's a man's sport. Charlemagne really lived like a man. He went, can you imagine? The man develops a pain in his side, but it's only after he went hunting. So he's elderly, and he's going hunting with a spear and with dogs and whatnot. I mean, he was, 72? I think. And he's still going out there. Sorry. But, he's just life goals. He's just when we get to Quebec, I can't wait to get some of the bande dessinée about him. They have bande dessinée about Charlemagne.
Awesome.
They're really cool.
I mean, Chuck North has nothing on him.
Oh, no. Before Kyle Katarna and Chuck Norris, there was Charlemagne. And, whenever Charlemagne farted, there was like 5 Chuck Norrises that were born. So, yeah. He's the coolest. He's the greatest. And yes, I'm a fanboy. Sue me. Because he was glorious, that's all. And he's also canonized, by the way. And his feast day is always the last Sunday in January. And I recall being a child, and there were still last Sunday masses in even French Ontario when I was a kid that were sometimes giving a special service because Charlemagne and Jeanne d'Arc were held in really high regard, and their feast days are kind of a big deal for French Christians. And with good reason, because Charlemagne might be le père de l'Europe. He's the father of Europe. But more than that, il est le père de la France. He is the father of France. And to anyone who says, well, what about Germany? No. He's more the grandfather of Germany, arguably.
Because the Germans hold him in high regard, which, who can blame them?
Yeah, well, that's because Germans have good taste. But the thing is, I would argue he's more the grandfather of the Germans. Weirdly, I'd say his grandson Louis l'Allemand, or Louis le Germain, Louis the German, is more the father of Germany. And Charlemagne's grandson Louis is really cool too. He was a political snake, but a brilliant military commander, and he's actually really cool. I can't wait to get into him as well. I'm sorry. It's just these Carolingians are really, 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 really cool. So to any Germans, don't take offense when I say Charlemagne is father of France, but grandfather of Germany. It's not to slight Germany. It's just, it's more Nestle that and whatnot that he's associated with, and with Francia. Whereas his grandson, it's when Louis, his grandson, comes in that we really start to see Germany kind of clump together and come together. I'd even say, to an extent, arguably, Othon le Premier is the father of Germany in a way. Othon le Premier is, or I think in English it's Otto the First, or Otto the Red. He is really cool. I really like him. He's one of my favorite historic figures, and he's arguably probably the coolest German who ever lived. No, Supermundi is. So Frederick II's the coolest. Otto the First is probably the second coolest. We'll get to him. He's really cool. Anyways, sorry, I have to geek out. I love this period. Now, Charlemagne dies at Aix-la-Chapelle on the 28th of January, 814, and is buried in the chapel. He was succeeded by his son Louis le Pieux, whom, I'll actually give Bradbury credit. Most historians regard Louis le Pieux as a poor successor to his great father. Yes, but no. And the thing is, now, what Bradbury says is that Louis is kind of the Theodosius to Charlemagne's Constantine, and says some have agreed. Now, he's not saying he agrees with this, but I guess it's apt, but I'm not sure. Bradbury makes the argument that under Louis, the empire became more truly Frankish than under Charlemagne. I don't see how. I don't get that argument. I really don't understand it. That said, Charlemagne had planned for a division of his empire in 806, but, the other sons died. And as Louis wasn't suffering from a bad case of being dead and was still alive, the empire to be safely given to him. Now, there were advisors at court who were trying to press Charlemagne into just giving it completely to one son. They didn't win out. Louis just simply outlived everyone. Now, Louis was born with a twin brother called Lothar in 778, which is also when his father became king. That's pretty auspicious.
Yep.
Now, Louis was. Now, the name Louis is a form of Clovis, and he's also called Le Debonair, or the Debonair. I guess because he was easygoing or good looking or good natured. I'm not sure. And of course, he was a great patron of monks and the priesthood, and he really was pious. Honestly, Louis is a very likable guy in history. He comes off as a bit of a nice guy. The only thing is, early in his reign, he does something a little mean. He chases off, I think, his sisters. Historians have often been harsh on Charlemagne's daughters. Now, Charlemagne didn't want to marry off his daughters, possibly for political reasons, possibly, very likely, out of genuine sentimentality. Because one of his daughters, he did early on intend to marry off to the Eastern Roman, or I should say, Greek emperor. She, I believe, died en route. Charlemagne was heartbroken, and I don't think he ever fully recovered. So he kept his daughters close to him. But the problem is, these daughters wanted to marry. Charlemagne was nervous about letting them marry. So instead, they'd take on lovers, and they would kind of live common law, and they'd mother grandchildren. And he kept the grandchildren at his court. Naturally, this became a very enormous court. Louis, on the one hand, did not really want to finance this. But on the other hand, he didn't need to immediately chase off his sisters. Like, come on, there's Dad's funeral. You could at least let them attend. But he did end up envying offing their husbands to a large extent. Most of the husbands ended up with territory and became powerful court. So, judge him however you want. But the thing is, he ended up facing a lot of Viking raids, which, oh boy, you can't hold that against him. This was a counterattack in some ways against Charlemagne's actions. So, excuse me. The Viking raids is a complicated topic. Because Charlemagne pressed so far into their territory, they're starting to raid. They become acquainted with Europe. So Scandinavia and Europe have their first real contact, I guess you could say. And it's violent. And Scandinavians being... Well, okay. For some reason, Scandinavians have developed a reputation in the modern world for being mellow and chill and not very masculine. We have a few Scandinavian friends. We have Scandinavian relatives. Oh my gosh, are they macho. Quite a few of them, like, any conversation becomes, almost a stick measuring contest. It does. They have very masculine sense of humor. The women do the cooking. Men watch sports and participate in hours-long swimming and hunting and fishing and, very macho, masculine stuff. They're very cool. Scandinavians, I don't think, have lost any semblance of their testosterone from 1,000 years ago. They are truly still the heirs of the Vikings. And I know Viking is actually a term for raider, but it's also turned into slang for Scandinavian hillbillies who jump into a boat and go pillaging and plundering the rest of us. The only thing I'll say is, shame on you, Scandinavians. Why aren't you pillaging and plundering still? You guys were awesome once. Make Scandinavia Viking again, or great again. Louis le Pieux faced some pretty big raids in this era, and there were also attacks from Slavs, Bulgars, Moravians, and Obodrit, as well as Saracens. And he faced rebellion from his nephew Bernard d'Italie, the illegitimate son of Pepin d'Italie. Bernard was, of course, defeated, condemned to death, and the sentence was commuted to blinding, but they didn't perfect the process, so he died. And Louis felt so bad, he decided to do penance for it. The trouble with this act of penance was it weakened his dignitas. I guess we'll use the Roman term because it was kind of still relevant at the time. People still thought in terms of the emperor's personal dignity. And to see the emperor humble himself and humiliate himself publicly, people begin getting ideas, especially his sons. And speaking of his sons, now his wife Ermengarde died in 818, and he chose Judith, the daughter of the Comte Welf de Bavarie. So he decided to marry into the Bavarian line. People have criticized this match. I'm going to say it's actually a smart one. Now, Louis was also, real quick, crowned Western Emperor at Reims in 816. So we have a coronation real quick of an emperor in Reims. Once again, cementing that city as very important religious site. But back to Judith. Judith, apparently her and Vala, a minister of Charlemagne, who had been imprisoned at one point but was removed from imprisonment, formed a bit of a, how do I put it? How do I put it? She provoked hostility from Vala, as said a former minister, and Louis' other sons. It got kind of bloody. And the thing is, the real trouble began in 823 when she bore a son, Charles. Naturally, she kind of liked her son better. Well, it's her blood. And Lothal and Louis, the two elder sons, did not like this. They did not like it one bit. And so it came to blows. And they ultimately ended up dethroning their father. And they imprisoned Charles, who was shut up in the Abbey of Prüm, and his mother was sent to Italy. This is actually a horrible thing to do to your father. And because of this, I am going to be honest, I don't like Lothal. I like Louis to an extent, but I still hold him accountable. It was a horrible thing for him to do. But Lothal, we know, was the real proponent of this rebellion. And the thing is, he broke imperial authority, but then he couldn't hold it together himself. And Louis was restored in 834. Now, just to be clear, Louis was defeated in 833 in Alsace. So, and he himself was, real quick, imprisoned in the Abbey of Saint Médard in Soissons. So, just to repeat, Louis is sent to Soissons, to Saint Médard. Charles Le Chauve, his son, is sent to Prüm, and the mother is sent to Italy. After Lothal, the eldest son, wins the war against the father, which Lothal had no reason to rebel. But the thing is, he was never satisfied with what he had. And naturally, when Louis is restored to the throne a year later, and crowned again, this time in Metz. It's supposed to be a new beginning. And he was to re-establish his authority. But he had to make concessions. Now, Charles de Chauve was enfiofed with Aquitaine. But, yeah, the empire was on shaky footing afterwards. And Louis le Pieux died in 840. Now, what was your view of Louis? Like, the penance was a bit of public self-humiliation, and it just... Yeah, okay, he screwed up with his nephew. But he took it too far. Like, because it weakened his authority and put him under the direct authority of the Pope, who then took advantage of it. And the Pope was already kind of a political enemy by this time. You had a very different Pope from those that had been clients of Charlemagne. So this is also another factor.
I could appreciate the fact that a part of him probably wanted to stop the kinocide, but
yeah,
it caught his marriage to his second wife caused problems with the children and the concerns that the older two had of their stepmother wanting to remove them completely and hand everything over to her son.
When really she was angling just for something for her son. There were too many sons. Her son stood to be disinherited. And she knew what would happen then. All she was fighting for was a portion for him. But the two, well, sort of the three elder sons were more concerned for themselves.
There needed to be far more boundaries established and pretty much stated, you're getting this, you're getting this, you're getting
well,
this.
Well, he tried that, and it just didn't work out with them.
And
he needed to be stronger. The thing about Louis is, much as Jim Bradbury is defending him, Louis was not a strong monarch.
And maybe the death of his nephew really broke something in him.
Maybe, but even before then he wasn't, like, he was very pious, and he put too much emphasis on religion to an extent. Now, he was a brilliant military commander, like everyone else in his family, but he was weak, and this weakness cost him dearly. In a way, this is the start of the decline of Carolingian, and Louis would set the example. And the thing is, after this, almost every Carolingien would face public humiliation whenever someone would try to take the throne from them. They would publicly humiliate them in a similar fashion. They would force them to be humbled. They would lock them up in abbeys, and they would just generally humiliate them. And some were strong, and you couldn't do that to them, like Louis the German. You couldn't do that to him. He was a badass. But, like, Charles de Chauve was pretty badass, but his sons would face problems. Like, a lot of the kids of these Carolingiens would face... of the sons, of Louis le Pieux would face a lot of problems. And from then on, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren would just end up having to fight to keep their crowns. And in Germany, it'd be lost to the Saxon dynasty. And I always say Saxe because in French we call it Saxe. It would be lost to them under Othon, le premier, deux, and trois. Mais you then have, if I slip into French, it's just like, this is French history, so and there's no script here. I'm struggling to just stay in English at times. It's just, I'm used to discussing this in French. Dan can vouch for that. Usually we slip into French and we just discuss this for hours in French. and so it's a bit of a struggle to stay in English and stay on track with that. Thank you for understanding. But the thing is, after Louis le Pieux's death, the lands got divided up. Now, on his deathbed, Louis complained that his sons, particularly of Louis the German, he has brought his father's gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. Now, Louis l'Allemand, Louis the German, married into the southern German nobility. Now, he's seen as a ruthless and sinful character, but much as there's talk of how sinful he is in this book, he was a formidable figure. I don't know why, but I just like him. He's really the founder in some ways of Germany, or the forefather of Germany. But he did subdivide his lands between his sons. He was treacherous. He had chronic backstabbing disorder that makes Mystique from X-Men look like, I don't know, a samurai. Yeah, it's like he was terribly disloyal. But he did protect his lands and his people with a fire and a passion that not every German ruler and leader has ever equaled. So
he had some loyalty
to his own. So, and we got to bear in mind, he was sent to Germany early in his life. Charles de Chauve was thrown into Neustrie and Aquitaine early in his life. So Charles de Chauve was really, I guess you could say, un franc. He was Français. He was French. Sort of. And you had Louis, who was German. Il était allemand. Deutsch. So these two might be half-brothers in terms of blood, but they're culturally very different people.
At that point, they're strangers.
Yes, exactement. And the thing is, they just... I remember reading somewhere that... I'm going to quickly skim real quick for this book. No, I don't think it's here. But I remember reading in one book that, interesting fun fact, when they had a conference at one point between them, they actually needed, I had read somewhere, translators to speak between them. Damn, they're brothers, but they can barely communicate with each other directly. C'est bizarre, eh?
Why?
Now, that might just be hearsay, but it's a nice little anecdote that suggests that they weren't altogether familiar with each other. And yet, weirdly, they'd form a political alliance that would hold them together for a long time. And they genuinely held to it in order to keep Lothal in line. So they weren't total scum. They understood that they needed each other. Because
they didn't fall into the same trap the Merovingians kept falling into.
They knew how to have a political alliance. Most of the Merovingians just kept fighting madly with each other. They just hated each other. They did form alliances and treaties with each other, but they would throw them over at the drop of a hat. Whereas Louis and Charles were far more diplomatic. Now, Lothal claimed the imperial title after his father died and decided to try to claim the lands of his brothers and try to grab as much as he could from them. And we'll just call his realm Lotharingie, which is what historians tend to call it. It's also called the Middle Kingdom, le Royaume du Milieu. But Lotharingie is a better title. It's named after him. He would end up losing a battle near Uxal in 841, and Lothair was defeated in a conflict that, honestly, Europe would never be the same, because this treaty at Verdun changed everything. Um, Lothair, of course, fled to Aix-la-Chapelle. Charles and Louis bound themselves together with games, mock battles, and the confirmation of a treaty in Verdun in 843. 843. It's now this treaty divided their territories from each other and established a border. Now the thing is, there's, how do I put it? There'd be more than 1,100 years of war over this border. This is the legacy they kind of left. And yet, the two did have a strong alliance to each other. But 1,100 years of history and war is the result. It's a very fascinating history, but oh man, was it violent. And now a good chunk of that border region is plutôt français, because France would invest a lot of money and resources into it, but it was denied to them after World War II. Well, you can't have France being too powerful and strong, because then they'll get ideas. I'm being sardonic, but on the other hand, the thing with the Germans at the time is that they had as good a claim as the French to the area, because, well, it's a border. But the border has fluctuated only ever so slightly, but generally kept to the same bit, which is basically the bit that one could also call Lotharingie. And it has been a nightmare for the two kingdoms. The two countries. Shoot, why did I say kingdoms? But the thing is, though, at first it didn't seem like a big deal. This is a temporary treaty. It's also a ceasefire in a way. Down the road, they're probably going to have to fight over it. But, it's not a big deal. It's only a big deal because they beat Lothair. But down the road, they'll probably have to renew it. It's probably just considered a temporary thing. But it became a permanent fixture. So it's pretty interesting. And, arguably, there has not been a treaty that has had longer lasting historic significance, at least in Europe, since almost ever, I think. And you could say, tracing back to the Roman Empire, in some ways I don't think the Roman Empire ever formed treaties that have had this effect. The Roman Empire had wars, conquests that had greater influence in some ways over the course of history. But in terms of just a treaty, this is a pretty darn big deal. Augustus naturally had a big, successful treaty with the Parthians, but that ultimately proved fairly elusive diplomatic victory, as later emperors were to reverse the triumph and turn it into a defeat many centuries later. But here, this is one that has kind of cemented the border. But, the cementing is something that could still change. And sorry if I sound cynical, but there might well be a future war between l'Allemagne, or Germany, Deutschland, and France in the future. Doubtless there will be more squabbling, more needling, more complaining, more fighting over that border region. It's just, the way it is. And it's history, so like that's part of it. And if anyone says, well, why can't they just stop the fighting forever? You'd have to wipe out all the human beings in that area. It's impossible. Or like, I know some people have told me, then why don't we just wipe out the history? That horrified me. That is one of the stupidest statements I ever heard. This history has to be remembered, because the only way you can negotiate truces and treaties is to remember Verdun. So much as this has had a lot of influence, that might seem negative at first, it's also had a lot of positive influence, as this border has generally been what France and Germany agree upon. So, like, oh, well, you took so much territory from me. How about we just go back to this? This has been the reset border a lot of times. So it has to be given some credit. And we defer to this treaty for a reason. There has to be a good reason for it. On the other hand, in the last few centuries, Germany's stepped over the mark and, invaded. Whereas on the other hand, France has culturally invaded and tried to convert a good chunk of that border region to French culture, so that ultimately it'll choose to be French. That's obviously the goal, and that's obviously what's going on. Whether it will remain German, whether it will go French, simple, I don't know. I imagine at some point down the road there will be more war between the two halves of what was once Francia. Now, and I also say that because the EU is impossible to hold together. It can't remain. And we often still see the division between l'Allemagne and France. That being said, Lothal, for his part, would reign until 855. And the thing is, he would end up the three brothers would sometimes ally with one, then the other. For example, Lothal and Charles would ally together at one point and had annual meetings without Louis. But in turn, Louis and Charles maintained their treaty. So all three brothers were kind of playing against each other. But when Lothal died, his son would succeed him. And this would have massive repercussions. And the thing is, his own territories were divided in three between his sons. Louis II took Italy, of which he had been king since 844. This Louis II got the imperial title. Now, if you're wondering why he's considered Louis II in France, I have no idea. Sorry, I'm not even going to try to cover it. I have no idea. It might be just because we're associating with the imperial title. But really, the Holy Roman Empire. Like, why isn't... I don't get it. Anyways, yeah. Charles de Chauve, who... Well, he would covet a lot of the lands of his nephews. And Lothal II received the northern area in Francia and Frisia, or near Francia, I should say. Charles of Provence was given Provence and Bourgogne, or Bourgogne, I should say. Though this youngest son was a very young child in 855. Basically, Charles de Chauve said, I want it all. And all three of Louis Lothal. Why did I say Louis? Lothal the first's sons died without legitimate heirs, and this is really the first real turning point of the Carolingian Empire. Um, we're gonna stop there. We're running over time, and um, here you have really, like you pointed out, Dan. They're following in the traditions of Merovingien, and it's just one son fighting with another or against a father. It's bloody. It's a terribly bloody period. But this chaos and inability to cement the empire as a whole will give rise to what I tend to call la période féodale. No, la, I should say, la période, a period that I might say in French, la période de l'époque des provinces en guerre, or a bit of the Sengoku Jidai of sorts. It's the Warring States period of France, and I know Italy and Germany had their own, but theirs would prove in some ways briefer than the French. The French one would be bloodier, messier, and arguably would prove a lot more interesting for one thing. Yes, I'm bragging. But on the other hand, once France came out of this Warring States period, her monarchy came out of it a lot stronger than the German or Italian monarchs. Well, I really should say Italy and Germany would share a monarchy. Maybe that's why the two, Italy and Germany, cling to each other so tightly. They share 1,000 years of history. France, for her part, had no bosom buddy, I guess you could say. She had only herself. Mais la douce France will next time be facing the rest of the Carolingian period, because we're going to divide this into two. The next period, hopefully, we'll be covering all the way up to the rise of the first Capetiens, which is an awesome story that should have gotten its own Geste Roland poem, La Défense de Paris. I love that story. I love it. But that hopefully we'll cover next time. Hopefully we'll be able to cover the entire 19th century up to that point. So don't forget to smash that like, that subscribe button if you're watching this or listening to this both on YouTube and on, Substack. Now, if you're listening to this on Substack, I'm just going to throw out the disclaimer. We have a discount right now for our paid subscription, which is for $11 American. And it is, I think, a pretty good fee for a full year's subscription, which will get you a named character in our epic poem, which will be about 23 books long, and it serves as a prequel to one of Dan's stories, a really, really good one. There will be access. There's also access to our later chapters of our stories, such as Swift Shadow Murders, Dark Spire Conspiracy, Khaled Bolg, and countless others, as well as the ability to comment on some of the Olymp Nomachi chapters. So if this sounds like your thing, feel free. A lot of the essays and whatnot will still remain free, because why not? If you're listening on YouTube, follow us on Substack, and we've got our paid subscription. We don't have Patreon or anything, so you could just support us on Substack. And all money from the Substack goes straight to paying for editing, for book covers, art for merch. So you're really paying for actual products. So none of this goes into coffee money, even though it'd be wondrous coffee money. But yeah. that being said, don't forget, like I said, don't forget to subscribe and everything. And don't worry, the next Plantagenet episode will be soon, because that's a separate book club we're still excited about, as well as a Campbellian book club, which will be continuing over on Substack. So those of you on YouTube, the Substack will be in the description down below, because, we want as many of you as possible to go join us over on Substack, because we do a lot more article writing than we do video making these days. So until next time, toodles.